Good evening. My name is Benjamin Franklin. Please forgive me, I'm a little worse for the wear, but after all, I've been dead for over 200 years. To be honest, I was hoping for a weekend in Paris since I've come all this way, but I'm sure there's plenty of excitement right here in Coos Bay. I am delighted to be with all of you. I must say, in my day, I was a popular fellow. But I'm a bit overwhelmed and very honored to see my name and image everywhere I look. I'm on postage stamps, monies, ships, cities, buildings, counties, streets, and even a dime store. Personally, I'm partial to my image on the $100 bill. But I'm not here to talk about myself. I've lived my life following a plan of 13 virtues, and number 2 on my list is silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself, and avoid trifling conversations. And so, without further ado, I present to you the star of this show, the box. I'd like to think of it as the Xbox of my generation. This box has been abused, exploited, guarded, and revered throughout its existence. It has held the hopes and dreams of millions, and it is the most precious keeper of our future. Inside this box lies your vote. Today we shall examine the social changes that affected the vote from the birth of our nation to the present day. Now, it is not my habit to look back. However, at times it is necessary to review the past so we may learn from it. We cannot change what early American society conceived as proper public policy, but we can try to understand the reasoning behind it. And that is why I am here. When our government was created, it was patterned after the English government of representation. The first representative assembly in colonial America took place in Jamestown in 1619. By the mid-1700s, representative government was the norm in the 13 colonies, and voting was commonplace, but not uniform. Public voting was the standard. Election day in the colonies was a social and important event. However, voter turnout was usually low. Elections were held in townships and cities, but voters who lived in the rural areas could often not afford to be away from the farm for the time that it would take them to get to the polling place. Now, contrary to popular belief, the United States was not founded in democracy. The concept of democracy conjured up images of disorder and mob rule by the uneducated, the poor, and the criminal-minded. And as a result, voting restrictions reflected 18th century notions about gender, race, prudence, and financial success. I'd like to read you something. In 1776, my good friend John Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and our second president, wrote this: "Depend upon it, sir, it is dangerous to open so fruitful a source of controversy and altercation as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. There will be no end to it. New claims will arise. Women will demand the vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to, and every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state. It tends to destroy distinctions and prostrate all ranks to one common level." So, as you can tell, relatively few of the early American inhabitants were deemed qualified to vote. Women were considered unable to deal with the coarse realities of politics, and a lack of basic education barred both the Indians and the Negro. Typical voter was a white male, at least 21 years of age, who owned property or paid taxes as a businessman or a merchant. The colonial leaders did this, believing that this voter had vested interest in the community and that he would pay taxes to promote its well-being. They wanted the white male voter to be independent and free thinking. and trustworthy, and thought this would keep the power of the vote from becoming a tool to be used by the wealthy for corrupt purposes. And I'm afraid that did not work out very well. Property ownership was almost always a suffrage requirement in most colonies, and the value of property, or the amount of land, came into play as well. This made no sense to me. Look at it this way. Today, a man owns a jackass worth $50 and he is entitled to vote. But before the next election, the jackass dies. The man, in the meantime, has become more experienced. His knowledge and the principles of government and his acquaintance with mankind are more extensive, and he is therefore better qualified to make a proper selection of rulers. But the jackass is dead, and the man cannot vote. Now, gentlemen, pray inform me. In whom is the right of suffrage? In the man or in the jackass? As you can tell, I'm rather passionate about this subject. Our Constitution was signed by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention on September 17, 1787. It was my hope that it would give men more rights than the jackass. However, voting rights are not even addressed in the Constitution. It leaves the determination of voting qualifications to the individual states. By not addressing the suffrage issue with clear guidelines and definitions, the Founding Fathers opened the proverbial Pandora's box. Our first guest story is an example of the problems this created across the country and the sacrifices people made in their struggle for universal suffrage.
I am Thomas Wilson Dorr, leader of the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island. I was the firstborn son of a wealthy Rhode Island family, and as a result, a member of the privileged upper class. I attended the finest boys' academy and graduated from Harvard in 1823. I studied law and was admitted to the bar in 1827. In spite of my privileged upbringing, I dedicated my life to ensuring the equality of all men and defending the sovereign rights of people to control their government. For several years, I traveled extensively to many of our sister states promoting my cause. I participated in forums, spoke at assemblies, built associations, and submitted legal resolutions objecting to the popular practice of limiting male suffrage exclusively to white males. This became the battle of my life. My political career began upon my election to the Rhode Island General Assembly in 1834. It was my intent to work within the government to effect change. Rhode Island was still governed under the original colonial charter of 1663, which restricted the right to vote to white males who owned property. Since the approval of our federal constitution, many of our sister states had adopted new constitutions and eliminated this requirement. Clearly, the outdated charter served to protect the interests of rich property owners while withholding the franchise of the vote from the average working man. By 1840, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and an influx of immigrants from Ireland, most of the men who worked for others in farming, fisheries, canneries, mills, and factories were not eligible to vote. The colonial charter provided no legal process to revise it. The controlling majority in the legislature was elected by a minority of property owners who fought against all attempts to democratize this archaic charter. Consequently, as few as 1,800 votes from the property-owning gentry could control the legislature representing 108,000 people. I joined arms with the working men and formed the Rhode Island Suffrage Association to address this untenable situation. We held public assemblies and demonstrations and organized marches to gain recognition for universal male suffrage. In 1841, we called for a state constitutional convention. The unsympathetic legislature called a rival convention and quickly drafted a new state constitution. Although they conceded to a few of our lesser demands in their draft, they still did not agree to universal male suffrage. Tensions grew as two complete state governments were elected. The People's Party government, in support of universal male suffrage, and the Freemen's Party government, in support of the colonial charter and the property gentry. By this time, the People's Party had gained enough public support to defeat the watered-down state constitution of the Freemen's Party and drafted our own constitution, which was overwhelmingly approved, but not accepted by the existing government. I was elected governor of the People's Party, and Samuel King became governor of the Freemen's Party. This was not an acceptable situation, and my repeated appeals to President Tyler to intervene went unanswered. Eventually, the People's Party resorted to a show of arms, which ended in a failed assault on the armory in Providence. I ordered members of my assault forces to disband, and Governor King then declared martial law. He used the power of his office to take aggressive, violent actions against the People's Party and its supporters. In the aftermath, the People's Party collapsed, and I was indicted for high treason. I took exile in New Hampshire. However, popular unrest promoted months of civil disobedience and armed clashes. Finally, to restore peace, the Freemen's Party drafted a new constitution adopting many of our reforms, including universal male suffrage. It was accepted by both parties and approved by the people of Rhode Island. In 1843, after its approval, I returned to Providence, believing that the new Constitution would protect my liberty. It did not. The old guard from the Freemen's Party had a vengeance that would not be denied. I was tried in the state Supreme Court in Newport by a jury of my most ardent opponents. I was found guilty of high treason, and on June 27, 1844, I was sentenced to solitary confinement at hard labor for life. The harshness of my sentence was widely condemned. Congress convened a congressional investigation, and after 12 months of hard labor, I was released. My civil rights were restored to me in 1851, and in 1854, the court judgment against me was formally set aside. Although my spirit was strong, my health was broken, but I was comforted by the knowledge that our hard-earned victory had helped to form a more perfect union. Thomas Wilson Dorr died on the 27th of December, 1854, at the age of 49. The cause of death was a respiratory infection, found primarily in prisoners who were kept in extreme solitary confinement in the dampness of dungeon-like cells.
As you can tell, a lack of continuity wreaked havoc from state to state. Over time, the federal role in elections has increased through amendments to the Constitution. At least 4 of those amendments specifically extended voting rights to different groups of citizens. However, individual states may still deny the right to vote for other reasons. And now, through the magic of this wonderful device that runs on electricity, we hear from our second guest.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Mundy Peterson. I was born in Metuchen, New Jersey in 1824, and my parents were slaves. When I was 4 years old, my mother and father were declared free, and the family moved to Perth Amboy, New Jersey, a city by the sea. I loved Perth Amboy and lived there for the rest of my life. I wanted to give you a bit of my background because I'm going to read you a story that I wrote. I was asked to record the events of a very special day for the local newspaper. As I recall, it was a quiet, gray Wednesday morning, a particularly busy day in my work week. I was in Carney's barn mucking out the stalls before going to my job as the school custodian. when Mr. Carney came into the barn and held up the newspaper so I could read the big black letters across the front page. 15th Amendment is law. Mr. Carney says to me, Monday, you should go vote today. I told him I would, and I had good intentions on the matter. So I finished spreading the clean hay, went on to work at the school. I lived around the corner from the school building, so it was my habit to go home for my noon meal. As it happened, I saw Mr. Marcus Spring, a neighbor, walking towards me. When I turned to open the front gate, Mr. Spring came up and said straight away, Monday, you should exercise your right to vote today. Well, it seemed both these gentlemen were giving me good advice. So I finished my lunch, brushed off my hat, put my jacket on, and walked towards the city hall. I was a bit nervous about voting. I never did it before, but the people at City Hall were very helpful. They wrote down my name, when I was born, and the number and street I lived on. I signed the registration paper, and the nice lady asked me to mark the date, which was March 31st, 1870. Then they handed me a ballot. It was a local election about our town charter. There were two choices. One side wanted to draw up a new charter, and the other side wanted to revise the charter we already had. I chose revised charter. When I walked out of City Hall, I was told I was the first Negro in Perth Amboy to cast a vote. Now, to be honest, I was glad for the fact of it, but I sure didn't plan any of it. So I just got on with my day. When it got around town that I was the very first black man to vote, it seemed the rest of my week was full of folks patting me on my back and shaking my hand. There was another gentleman from Princeton that claimed he was the first black man to vote after passage, and I didn't want to take false credit. So I went down to City Hall and asked the clerk if he could check and make sure one way or the other. As it turned out, the other person didn't vote until April. So I was the first. He handed me the report and shook my hand. Monday, he said, you officially own the honor. You are the first black man to vote in an election under the just enacted 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That statement made me stop in my thoughts. I own the honor. I own the honor. I was telling my friends at church how I was thinking sometimes a person gets picked for a special chore. Maybe the Lord chose Mr. Thomas Mundy Patterson for this task. My friend Rebel asked me, what task? Rebel, I said, think about it. Think about all those poor souls that came before us. My mother, bless her heart, your father and mother, so many folks we know, and even more that we don't. They never had a say in the road of their life. They never had no rights. You and I are free men, and now we can be a part of the decision making by voting. I could see in Rebel's look, he was beginning to understand. I asked him if he voted last week, and he said no. Now I'm thinking, this is my task. I need to get my folks moving. In my mind, the best way to persuade people toward change was by example. When someone is held down for so long, it takes a while to help them get up on their feet. So Rebel and I went right down to City Hall, and I helped him make out the papers for voter registration. On Declaration Day, 1884, the town leaders presented me with the medal to honor the first black man to vote after passage. It's a handsome round medal with a picture of President Lincoln on it. I was very proud of myself when they pinned it on me. I never considered myself properly dressed without it affixed to me on my vest. You know, I think Mr. Carney was true when he said it was a privilege. Am I up to the task? I pray that I am.
More blacks were elected to public office during the period from 1865 to 1880 than at any other time in American history. These legislators introduced such radical programs as universal public education and set aside all racially biased laws, including laws prohibiting interracial marriage. Between 1870 and 1876, more than 700,000 blacks were granted the right to vote. The flame of hope burned bright for a short period, and then flickered in the winds of resentment, hatred, and ignorance. The black male voter would endure residency requirements, payment of poll taxes, literacy requirements, and much more in the years that followed. In the meantime, the ladies decided it was their time, their voices were heard. And as usual, once they decided to talk, there was no stopping them. There were thousands of women all over the country who devoted themselves to the suffrage movement, and some even gave their lives for the cause. Two women who were at the forefront of this movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They are more than capable of telling it on their own story, so it is with great pleasure I introduce to you Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
I was born Elizabeth Cady in 1815 in Johnstown, New York. My father was a lawyer. I sometimes sat in the corner of his office listening, and I was aghast at the injustices suffered by his women clients. Father usually could do nothing because the law favored men. I had a sharp mind, and with my father's influence, I attended Johnstown Academy, a college preparatory school for men. Then Mrs. Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary. I graduated in 1832 with only two career choices, wife or school teacher. As a result, my goal became fighting against the fundamental causes of women's oppression. Now, my Uncle Garrett Smith was an abolitionist. His house was a station on the Underground Railroad for slaves escaping to the north. Uncle Garrett taught me that sometimes a thing may be legally right, but morally wrong. It was at his house that I met Henry B. Stanton. He wrote and spoke eloquently against slavery and against alcohol. He believed that women should pursue higher education and participate more in business. I accepted his marriage proposal in 1840, but only after he invited me to accompany him to London, where he was a delegate to the World's Anti-Slavery Convention. In London, I met Lucretia Mott. Mrs. Mott and I were infuriated that the motion to admit women as delegates to the convention was denied. We swore that we would hold our own convention when we returned to America. But alas, my life was consumed with 3 little boys. For 6 years I felt isolated, so I was overjoyed when Mrs. Mott visited me in Seneca Falls in 1848. Together with a group of Quaker women, we organized the first ever Women's Rights Convention. I modeled our Declaration of Sentiments after the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. I wrote the 9th resolution, that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. I put all my energies into women's suffrage. I delivered dozens of speeches, wrote news columns and papers, and had another son. By this time, my father was a New York Supreme Court justice, and he forbade me to speak out. But I was steadfast in my beliefs. Then, in 1851, I met Susan B. Anthony. She was an earnest worker in the temperance movement. I believed in temperance, but could not convince Susan that being able to vote would gain women permanent headway. Over the next few years, my friendship with Susan strengthened, and I began writing her speeches. I forged the thunderbolts, and she delivered them. I was overwhelmed with my family, but I worked on my speeches at night. Susan watched the children, 7 of them by now, so I could concentrate and write. During the Civil War, Susan and I focused our efforts on abolishing slavery. After the war, women's suffrage became even more important. Susan and I presided over the American Equal Rights Association in New York, which combined anti-slavery and women's rights movements with a common goal of universal suffrage. Much to our horror, the first bill introduced proposed enfranchisement only for black males. Women were not mentioned. We were bitter and indignant. In spite of our efforts, the 14th Amendment was ratified, limiting the vote to male citizens. In 1867, while touring the wild new state of Kansas, complete with bed bugs and lice, I met George Train, who offered to finance a weekly newspaper for our cause. Susan was the publisher and I was the main writer. We called it The Revolution. The title shocked people, and people needed to be shocked. Our slogan was, "Down with politicians, up with the people." Our principles were educated suffrage irrespective of sex or color, and equal pay for women for equal work. Although our newspaper was a political success, Mr. Train had to withdraw his financial support, and we were forced to sell after 3 years. In 1869, Susan and I founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, and I served as its president for 21 years. Our goal was to gain suffrage votes 1 state at a time. I continued to write speeches for Susan and joined yet another unsuccessful suffrage movement in New York State. What a set of jackasses we have in Albany. I have written several of them, and they simply bray in return. My children's higher education was so expensive that in 1869 I agreed to go on an 8-month speaking tour, which turned into 10 years. I was the most widely known woman speaker in the United States, and I received $100 for each speech. During this time, Susan and I, and my daughter Harriet, collaborated on writing the history of women's suffrage, faithfully recording the early struggles of women for our rights. In 1890, I retired from the public platform, and I dedicated myself to writing. I could no longer clamber up and down platforms and mount long staircases into halls and hotels. But I can still do good work with my pen, and it shall be at the service of our reform so long as its powers last. My last major speech was called The Solitude of Self, which I delivered in 1892. My followers said it was my best speech. All but Susan. She wanted me to talk only of voting. In 1865, I published my most controversial work, The Woman's Bible, my commentary on the scriptures that I feel are derogatory to women. And in 1898, I penned my autobiography, 80 Years and More, to inspire others to fight for the rights of women. I dedicated it to Susan B. Anthony, my steadfast friend for half a century. Before I turn the podium over to her, I have a final word for our daughters and granddaughters. The best protection any woman can have is courage.
My name is Susan B. Anthony. When I was a child in the 1820s, my Quaker upbringing taught me that men and women were equal before God. I soon learned that that idea was not commonly accepted when my teacher refused to show me how to do long division because I was a girl. Had I been able to afford college, none would admit me. Teaching was the only respectable profession available to me, but my earnings were a fraction of the wages paid my male colleagues. I was barred from the debate at teachers' conventions because it was indecent for women to speak in public. How could I accept a marriage proposal and give up my life work for wifely subservience and home drudgery? Why, as a wife, under the law, I would be a non-person, the property of my husband. I could not own property, make contracts, divorce the man if he abused me, or be guardian of my own children. Because I am a woman, I cannot vote to improve women's status and achieve the basic rights of a citizen of the United States. In 1851, I met the woman who was to change my life, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We became the dearest of personal friends for over 50 years. Partners in arms for the cause of women's rights. Mrs. Stanton philosophized, I organized. We went on the road together to teach and recruit women to the cause, creating armies of women's rights suffrage organizations. Mrs. Stanton and I had our disagreements. She kept having children. I'm very fond of children, but for a leader of the cause to be saddled with a brood and home chores when she is needed in the field is atrocious. Once, when she joined me on the road without the speech she was to deliver the next day, I locked her in her room and made sure she was undisturbed until she was prepared. Since I am a single, independent woman, I could do a great deal more traveling and speaking than Mrs. Stanton. I went all over the country into every nook and cranny teaching women's rights and the necessity of gaining the vote. For almost 50 years, I gave 75 to 100 speeches a year. I'd spend months on the road yearly, meeting with women's groups in the afternoon, giving public lectures in the evening, then moving on to another town. For a shy person who lacked self-confidence, it took discipline to withstand the booze and catcalls, the rotten eggs and bawdy songs, even threats. Many people thought giving the women the vote was an arrogant folly, which would destroy family life, dissolve happy marriages, and wreck the government. To them, I was a troublemaker, an infidel, a pestiferous fanatic. On tour, I encouraged women to educate their husbands and their sons, to say a word to the butcher, the minister, the mayor, concerning the women's vote. I taught them to tuck a woman's suffrage leaflet into a note to a friend or into a payment to a creditor. I was a networker, an organizer, a fundraiser, sharing my skills with other women in order to keep the woman's right to vote in the forefront of public discussion and action. Mrs. Stanton and I faced such disappointments. We were betrayed by our friends and allies when they supported the constitutional amendment to give black males the vote, bypassing white and black women. The New York legislature passed a progressive women's rights measure, which was quietly repealed while our attention was focused elsewhere. There never will be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers. Now, the 14th Amendment said that I was a citizen of the United States and that no state could abridge my privileges. So, I went and voted in the 1872 election for Ulysses S. Grant. A warrant was issued for my arrest and bail set. My aim was to get my cause to the Supreme Court. But my lawyer paid my bill, losing me the right to take women's votes to the High Court. My trial was a farce. The judge refused to let me testify because, as he ruled, women are incompetent, and he would not permit the jury of my peers, all male, to deliberate. He directed them to find me guilty as charged for the crime of voting. I never paid the fine imposed. Mrs. Stanton and I spent 6 years working on a history of women's suffrage. Men have been faithful in noting every heroic act of their half of the race, and now it should be the duty of women to make for future generations a record of the heroic deeds of the other half. I love to make history, but I hate to write it. In 1878, the senator from California proposed an amendment to the Constitution. The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The amendment never made it out of committee. Called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, it was reintroduced in every session of Congress for the next 42 years. I booked the National Women's Suffrage Convention in Washington, D.C. every winter so members from each state could lobby for the women's vote. They knew when we were in Washington. I was such a familiar symbol of women's suffrage that the red shawl I wear became a celebrated item. I appeared on stage in Capital City wearing a white shawl, and veteran reporters sent me a note. No red shawl, no report. I sent to the hotel for the item and donned it to applause. Then reporters picked up their pencils. Late in the crusade, Mrs. Stanton and I disagreed on strategy. She found it confining to focus on the right to vote as a means to achieve justice and equality. She lectured on birth control. Her woman's Bible caused hysteria. Not that I disagreed with her ideas, but in order to carry out a peaceful revolution, one must tolerate and work with others, find common ground, form coalitions. Mrs. Stanton alienated many who could have been supporters of the women's vote. I retired as president of the Women's Suffrage Association in 1900 to watch the younger generation take the helm and scold when I had to. Before my dear Mrs. Stanton passed away in 1902, I wrote to her. For 51 years we have been busy stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women, but we are compelled to leave the finish of the battle to another generation. But they enter upon this task equipped with a college education, with business experience, and with the fully admitted right to speak in public, all of which were denied us 50 years ago. Ancient prejudice has become so softened, public sentiment so liberalized, and women have so thoroughly demonstrated their ability as to leave not a shadow of a doubt that they will carry our cause to victory. With such great progressive women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible. Pardon me for stepping out of character, but this year marks the 108th anniversary of the passage of women's right to vote in Oregon. Susan B. Anthony had the pleasure of working alongside Mrs. Abigail Scott Duniway in her fight on behalf of Oregon women. And it is my great pleasure to introduce her to you now.
Hello, I'm Abigail Scott Duniway. Oregon women were allowed by Oregon men to vote in state elections beginning in 1912. I had a lot to do with that. I grew up in the large Scott family in Illinois. My poor mother bore 12 children. 3 died early. As I watched her struggles, I vowed never to be a household drudge. I had very little schooling. I was often too ill or too tired from working on our family farm to walk the mile to school and another mile back again. But I learned to read and loved it. I also wrote and had some poesies and other things published. In 1852, my family, 9 children and 2 parents, started for Oregon by covered wagon. The Oregon Trail journey was an adventure, but very, very hard. My mother and 3-year-old brother, Willie, both died of cholera along the way. In the Oregon Territory, I taught school in a small cabin west of Salem. There I met Ben Duniway, also from Illinois, whom I married. Like my friend Mrs. Stanton, in our ceremony I did not promise to obey. We lived in many different places, but my work was always the same. I became a household drudge. Ben, a kind and loving man, looked after our 6 children when I worked away from home. At different times, I taught school, took in boarders, and in Albany, Oregon, opened a successful millinery shop. Women customers often talked to me about their difficulties, how they had to be clever to be able to buy something they wanted, how some women were left destitute when their husbands abandoned them, and that a woman could be held responsible for her husband's unpaid debts. One evening in 1870, when I complained to Ben, he suggested that things would never get better for women until they were able to vote. Vote? Vote! Those words were like a splash of cold water on my face. I had never considered that, but it made sense. If we had the vote, we could help elect people who would make laws who would allow women more control of their lives. I gathered some of my friends and we formed the State Equal Suffrage Association, and I started working to get the vote. I thought it might take maybe 5 years. It took more than 40. In 1871, we moved to Portland. I borrowed money and rented a building where I set up a printing shop for my newspaper, The New Northwest. I printed letters to the editor, news of suffrage activities in other places, and promotion of our own efforts. I kept the newspaper going for 16 years as a strong voice for equal suffrage. Later, in 1871, Susan B. Anthony came to Oregon. She camped with our family at Oregon State Fair in Salem, and then she and I traveled all over Washington and Oregon territories. Miss Anthony taught me how to arrange for and lead meetings, and how to speak to people from large crowds to small groups. We met in homes, schools, churches, pool halls, saloons, out of doors, wherever we could. At one saloon, men were sitting around and spitting on the floor. Right there, I removed 2 rows of ruffles from the bottom of my dress for sanitary reasons. After 2 months of intensive training, I felt ready to continue on my own. We never knew what would happen at a meeting. People had such strong views for or against women voting. Audiences might be receptive or antagonistic or a mixture of both. I had to be quick-witted to respond to hecklers and just plain hard-headed folk. At one of my meetings, a man said, "A hen cannot crow." And I replied, "A rooster cannot set." While I was working hard to promote women's suffrage, my brother Harvey Whitefield Scott was fighting against it. He was editor and part owner of the Oregonian newspaper, which he would not allow to support the work of suffragists. Though we loved and respected each other, we were on opposite poles of suffrage. Harvey was active in civic affairs and surely appreciated his right to vote as a white male citizen, but he said he was against irresponsible voting by Negroes, women, and others. In 1872, I attended the National Convention of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and back home, I visited the Oregon State Legislature, the first woman to do so on her own. A suffrage bill had been introduced, and I was invited to speak. Frightened and astonished, I did so. The suffrage bill did not pass. In 1884, Oregon's first attempt to pass a suffrage measure failed. Between 1882 and 1885, I crossed the continent 4 times to attend national meetings. In 1885, I gave 219 lectures. In 1886 and 87, I gave 181, logging 3,000 miles by stage, steamer, train, buggy, buckboard, and on foot. I've been yelled at, gossiped about, endured vicious rumors, had eggs thrown at me, and was burned in effigy. I was also severely criticized for my leadership in my own organization. I'm not the softest, most easygoing woman you could meet. I'm determined, capable, and committed to my cause. My critics use words such as blunt and heavy-handed, which are not untrue. A couple of women doctors in Oregon thought they could get better results, and I left them to it. My husband Ben was in poor health and had gone to Idaho with some of our sons, so I sold my newspaper and joined them. We went back and forth between Portland and Idaho for 7 years. In summers, I worked to help Idaho women suffragists. I spent my winters in Portland writing. In 1896, Idaho women gained the right to vote, and my dear Ben died. That set me back a good deal. We had been married more than 40 years, and he had been my steadfast emotional support, my strong right arm. After a time of grieving, I rejoined the fray. I would not give up. In 1897 and 1899, there were 2 more unsuccessful attempts to get a suffrage bill through the Oregon legislature. In 1900, the second statewide vote for women's suffrage again resulted in defeat. Oregon men adopted the initiative and referendum in 1902, allowing citizens to suggest and vote on proposed laws. We began collecting signatures for an initiative proposing women's suffrage, but we didn't have enough signatures in time for the deadline. The temperance movement was very strong in Oregon. Many women worked hard to outlaw liquor, and some had the bright idea of joining our two causes together. I did not believe a law to prevent people from drinking would work. Isn't it true that when you tell someone he or she can't do something, it makes that person more determined than ever to do it? Men who like to drink said, "Wait a minute. If we let women vote, they'll take away our liquor. Nothing doing." Nevertheless, I thought I should try to work with the temperance people. I invited the National Suffrage Association to hold its convention in Portland in 1905. I wanted them to see the progress we were making here. They came, bringing their temperance views with them. Some stayed afterward to help us run the 1906 election in Oregon. The national leaders and we in Oregon had entirely different views on how to run a campaign. But by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. In 1906, the first Equal Rights Amendment to the Oregon Constitution was proposed by petition and placed on the ballot. The measure failed, as did a separate measure to establish prohibition in Oregon. I'm afraid I became contentious. People said so. Yes, I did call a few bitchy women names that weren't complimentary. I was so frustrated with some women in Oregon and from the national organization who tried to take over our campaign, and I believe they contributed to our loss in 1906. We kept on, and measures were once again voted down in 1908 and 1910. October 1912, I turned 78 years old, and a large party was held in my honor. Even though many people, women as well as men, disagreed with my position on women's suffrage, they did respect my work, and I had many friends. By this time, 8 other states had adopted suffrage for women. We were running a strong campaign using newspaper ads and articles, rallies, posters, direct letters to voters, and a float in the Portland Rose Parade. My brother Harvey Scott had died, and the Oregonian newspaper now supported us. On the morning of November 6th, 1912, I was awakened by noise in the street, loud, happy noise. The suffrage measure had passed. I might have danced in the street myself if I had not been ill. The margin was not huge, 52% in favor, 48% against. But we had won on the 6th attempt. It was a strange feeling, but most welcome after 42 years of hard work. The governor asked me to write the proclamation for the constitutional amendment. I've written many things in my lifetime, but writing the proclamation for the Oregon equal suffrage law was the most important writing I have ever done. It gave me great joy and satisfaction. More than 500 people gathered for a celebratory banquet November 19th. I spoke, and afterward, a male acquaintance said he had heard me speak several times, but never so well. I replied that he had never before heard me speak as a free woman. 2 years later, in 1914, I was the first woman in Multnomah County to register to vote. The governor arranged for me to be the first woman in Oregon to vote in that fall election. I knew it had to be, that we would win the right to vote sometime, and I am so glad I lived long enough to actually do it.
What lovely ladies. If I were only 150 years younger, but back to task. The Anthony Amendment, first introduced to the U.S. Congress in 1878, was finally passed in 1919 and went to the state legislature for ratification. 36 of the 48 states would have to ratify for women's suffrage to become law. So many people think one vote won't make any difference, but our next guest will prove to you that that is not the case.
Hello, my name is Harry Byrne. It is 1920, and I'm the youngest House member of the Tennessee General Assembly at only age 24. I'm not running for office right now, thank God. I might not win. You see, I did something. Well, let me just tell you. I was raised by my mother, a well-educated and very strong-willed woman who always taught me that a good boy always does what his mother asks him to do. In June of 1919, a U.S. constitutional amendment to allow women to vote passed Congress, and 35 states ratified it. One more was needed, and suddenly, it was my turn. Now, my mother is in strong favor of equal suffrage, and she follows the campaign by reading newspapers and magazines. She hoped I would support the suffrage bill, but I wasn't so sure. I agreed with her, but most of the people who elected me are conservative. I didn't think those men would want me to allow women to vote. Some women are even against it. Mother wrote me a letter which arrived the morning of voting day. In part, she said, "Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet." At the end of the letter, she said, "Don't forget to be a boy." When the question came before us, the mood in the House was tense. If you were in favor of equal suffrage, you wore a yellow rose in your lapel. If you were against it, you wore a red rose, as I did. As I looked around, the supporters and antis seemed to be about equal. I actually hoped the matter would be tabled and not come before the Assembly again until next year, when I might not even be here. But I'm not that lucky. When my name was called, my palms were sweaty and my throat was dry. Mine would be the deciding vote. I reached into my pocket and I felt my mother's letter there. And I voted aye. There was silence in the chamber. Then there was an eruption. I left quickly thinking that I might be attacked, and I was attacked verbally in the days that followed. I even made sure I had a bodyguard for a while. But my mother was happy, as were many thousands of other women. Equal suffrage was finally the law of the land. I think I did the right thing.
The power of a mother's love is an amazing thing, isn't it? With the help of the female vote, Harry Byrne was reelected to a second term in the Tennessee legislature and spent his life in various state government positions. Almost none of the women who had attended the Seneca Falls Convention 72 years earlier were alive to celebrate the victory. The great leaders you met, Elizabeth, Susan, Abigail, and many others, were gone. Different women had carried on the fight, including Carrie Chapman Catt, who went on to be a founder of the League of Women Voters. Now we fast forward, way forward, to 1965. It is difficult to imagine, but it took that long for America's indigenous people to gain the vote. And again, through the magic of electricity, I'd like to present a beautiful young lady who will tell you about the struggle of the American Indians to claim a right that was long overdue.
My name is Josephine Wakanda. I grew up on the Isleta Pueblo Reservation in New Mexico. I want to tell you my father's story and a bit of the story of the American Indian struggle for voting rights. Of course, that part of the story differs by state, since each state determines its own voting qualifications, but my father's story is typical of the stories of so many of our people. Now, you would think that the 15th Amendment, which barred states from limiting voting on account of race, would have done the trick for the American Indian vote. But states had other ways to keep American Indians from the polls. They claimed Indians were not residents because Indians belonged to sovereign nations and lived on reservations. They demanded assimilation into white, civilized culture, and they mandated that Indian voters pay private property taxes when we hold tribal lands in common. It wasn't until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 that Indians could retain tribal membership and be a citizen of the United States. But that act did not create the right to vote. To be fair, in some states, a few Indians achieved the vote by accepting land allotments, serving in the armed forces, giving up tribal affiliations, and by jumping into the melting pot to the satisfaction of local white communities. Also, to be fair, some American Indians were scared of the vote because they did not trust the government that had taken their land, reneged on treaties, and discriminated against them. Many were suspicious of the registration process because throughout their history, registration led to taking our land, relocating our communities, and forcefully removing our children into boarding schools. My dad, Miguel Trujillo, always felt that Indian people should be recognized by what they did, rather than put aside or shunned because we were Indians. He had just gotten his college degree when World War II broke out, and he volunteered to serve his country along with 25,000 other Indians. But when he came home to New Mexico, a state where Indians not taxed may not vote, he decided to right a wrong. On June 14, 1948, Miguel Trujillo went to vote and was rejected. He sued the state of New Mexico, and the federal court ruled that New Mexico had discriminated against its Indians by restricting the vote on the basis of private property tax. After all, we paid the state and federal taxes required. I am proud. My dad made it possible for Indians to begin voting in New Mexico. Now, I say begin because Indians were still afraid that voting would cost them their homes, their way of life, and their tribal sovereignty. And voting did not come easy. We had no voting places on the reservation. Indians with college degrees were told they couldn't read well enough. Some Indians who had English as a second language couldn't understand the voting instructions, and the gerrymandering to dilute the Indian vote. Thank goodness for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which said that all of those tricks which abridge or deny citizens' rights to vote were not going to be tolerated. Since then, we have brought 74 court cases to uphold the rights of American Indians as voting citizens of the United States, most of which have been successful. I'm glad to say that in recent years, Indian voter turnout has significantly improved in the United States, involving its native people in the political forces shaping the legal landscape that we live in.
To most people, it appeared that all those who had wanted the vote had finally won it. However, over 1 million young men had given their lives for this country who were too young to vote for the leaders that sent them into battle. The long debate over lowering the voting age in America from 21 to 18 began during World War II and intensified during the Vietnam War. That war claimed more than 58,000 American soldiers and sparked an unprecedented uprising of young people eager for the right to vote. My friends will now share their stories.
Dear President Washington, I am the mother of the dearest son. He is but 19 this day, but his innocence is lost to him. He has come back from the great revolution, a man beyond his years. I give glory to the grace of God that he returned to me unharmed in body. I cannot state the same for his heart and soul. He would have it no other way, for he is forever sincere in his loyalty to America and to you, sir. I am not wise in the ways of politics, but this I know. My husband died at the Battle of Brandywine, and with him my son's right to vote. My family has invested everything and lost much. Will my country deem my son of value, or is he but fodder for the cannons of conquest? What rewards will his country bestow on him and all young men who gave themselves over to the cause? Sincerely, Charlotte Pelham, Quincy, Massachusetts, 1779. This letter went unanswered.
Dear President Lincoln, my God, sir, this is such a ghastly war. Every day seems more terrible than the last. I am a field doctor in the Union Army. My days are filled with savage surgery and the unclean conditions of a tent hospital. The Battle of Fredericksburg was lost to the Union, but I tell you, sir, it was a costly victory for our Confederate brothers. The battlefield was a sea of gray coats soaked with blood, guts, and body parts. I admit I write this to you in my weariness and with a broken heart. I know you feel the same pain. These young boys carry pictures and images of you with them into battle, trusting you to lead our country in the right direction. A country in which their bodies are sacrificed, but their voices are not heard. How shall we compensate such valor? How will we reward their sacrifice? Bless you, sir, for holding steady the rudder of a cause that must be won. Assistant Surgeon, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, Fredericksburg, Virginia. This letter went unanswered.
Dear President Wilson, I love my country, and I shall always give over all that I have for the sake of keeping it safe. I was raised in a New York orphanage, and I volunteered for duty when I turned 18. I have no family, and have come to think of you as a mentor. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I am compelled to describe the extreme conditions we must endure here on the front lines outside of Verdun. Forgive me if my writing is a bit shaky, but I write from behind the protection of a gas mask. I am a sergeant in the Army. I am only 20, but a senior to some of these new boys. It's not unusual for a young lad to fall dead in the trench next to you because he dared to spy over the top of the trench only to be dropped by a sniper's bullet. The human enemy is tough enough, but there is a terror inside the trenches that few Americans can comprehend. Rats the size of cats, fleas, lice, and mites distract focus, and diseases abound in our damp, contaminated earthen nests. I hope to survive this and come home to my beloved America, Mr. President. And if I do survive, what shall I have for it? Will I be allowed to cast my vote in opposition to another war? Will the young soldier lying dead beside me be of no more concern, or will the tragedy of his sacrifice be pondered in your great halls? With deepest respect, Ronald Jones, Army volunteer soldier from New York. This letter went unanswered.
Dear President Roosevelt, you have so much on your mind these days, and part of me says I'm being selfish to bother you with my thoughts. But I write on behalf of my only son who lost his life on that terrible day in Hawaii. I will never forget your voice when you addressed the nation with the news of December 7th. I had just finished a letter to my son, Robert Jr., that morning. His last letter to his mother and me was full of hope for his future. If he had returned home to the family farm in Puxatawny, he would have returned to school and become a marine biologist. his duty on board the USS Arizona was a source of pride to him. I know how he felt. I was proud of my service, as was his grandfather before me. My son was 18. His country called on his service, and he paid the ultimate price. He admired you, as do I, Mr. President. Is it not a sad state that had he lived, he could not cast a vote for you? With sadness and regard, Robert Dickinson, farmer, Puxatawney, Pennsylvania. This letter went unanswered.
Dear President Truman, I am sitting in the waiting room of our local hospital. My daughter-in-law is in labor as I write. My husband and I are about to become grandparents for the first time. I wish our son could be here on this blessed occasion, but he is on patrol near the 38th parallel in the dead of a very cold Korean winter. He will be 20 in 2 months. A bit young to be a father, but he's up to the task. He's a responsible, mature, good-natured fellow, and he willingly serves the country he loves. Good news, he has a son of his own now. We are told the baby is healthy and robust. My daughter-in-law wants me to tell you that our grandson will be named Harry T. Ryder. Won't you join me in a prayer for my son's safe return? He is a patriot, and now he is a father. I find it troublesome that he admires you and believes in his country, and yet he cannot vote for you in the next election. Gloria T. Ryder, loving mother and grandmother. This letter went unanswered.
Dear President Johnson, 1 month ago today I received word that my twin brother died in the line of duty. I will take comfort in knowing that he was not alone. His best friend was near his side when his legs were blown off by a landmine. I wish I could tell you that he didn't suffer, but that was not the case. I thank God that his friend was able to stay by his side as he fought to be brave in the face of a lingering and painful death. My parents think I am disrespectful because I cannot condone my country's need to send America's young men into that insatiable meat grinder called Vietnam. I will finish school and get my law degree, but I will also attend sit-ins and rallies. I do it for my brother. I just wanted to let you know that I will be attending a protest march in Washington, D.C. the last week of this month. Look for the girl wearing the red bandana and carrying a sign that reads, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote." Mr. President, don't you think America owes them that privilege at least? Renee Williams, law student, Berkeley, California. Finally, after 200+ years, an answer was received. On July 5th, 1971, President Richard M. Nixon signed the final draft of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Section 1 reads, "The rights of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of age." During the amendment signing ceremony in the East Room, President Nixon talked about his confidence in our youth of America, saying, "As I meet with this group today, I sense that we can have confidence that America's new voters, America's young generation, will provide what America needs. Not just strength and not just wealth, but a spirit of moral courage, a spirit of high idealism in which we believe in the American dream, but in which we realize that the American dream can never be fulfilled until every American has an equal chance to fulfill it in his own life."
Well, there you have it. The history of Americans gaining voting rights without restriction is long, and it was not a smooth road. There were setbacks, defeats, and long struggles. The process was a mixture, rather like, well, succotash. Even today, people in some states of America want to prevent other people from voting. Many people dedicated and sometimes sacrificed their lives to secure the vote for you today. The vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument that we have in a democratic society. We must make it simple and convenient for all our citizens to be able to participate in the democratic process. Here in Oregon, your system is working well. Register, receive a ballot by mail, and vote. It's been a pleasure spending time with you this evening. See you on Election Day. And remember, I'll be watching.